back to the Jamal Thomas Morning Show. I want to go into the interview with Glenn Diesen. I want to go into that. Now, I want to go into the interview with Glenn Diesen. Now, I asked him these questions. I'm going to give you the question first, and then I'm going to let him respond to the question. It's about 20 minutes, give or take. I think it's a really good interview. I've asked Glenn because Glenn has a certain point of view. I watched an interview with him, Alexander Macarius, and John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer made this argument that effectively we are living in the jungle in regards to international relations, that because there's no higher authority, the countries effectively fight for supremacy, and that the fight for supremacy on some level is normal and is natural. And so it's not necessarily the US fault, or it's not necessarily China's fault. It's more so the context to which they operate that pushes them into certain behaviors of trying to go for dominance. Now, I fundamentally disagree with that. Because truth be told, whether you are fighting for supremacy or whether you're deciding to work with cooperation in win-win relationships, both of those things are choices. Nobody is forcing you to take a position that I believe in zero-sum outcomes. You can make a choice on whether you want a zero-sum outcome or, for that matter, whether you decide to cooperate. And you can't even really make the argument that it's purely in your best interest to be a zero-sum or to not cooperate, when there are all sorts of benefits that come along with cooperation, one of which, less chaos, and another one of which is more organization. Organization is usually a pathway to get bigger and larger things accomplished. I guess my point is, it's no more natural for the US to be at constant conflict and engage these countries purely from the standpoint of dominant and vassal, any more than it is to engage countries from the standpoint of how can we have win-win relationships that is good for both of us, where we recognize each other's sphere of influence and recognize each other's priorities and work towards, when you can, not conflict or deconflicting red lines as they occur, but also understanding that those countries are going to work towards their own best interests. And it doesn't need to be, I win all and you lose all. It can be both of us win. Mearsheimer doesn't seem to believe that, and seems to believe that the natural state is conflict. Whereas from my point of view, it's not natural at all. It's a choice. I want to play the interview, though, and I'm going to let Glenn speak for himself. So the first question was, you were in a recent discussion with Alexander Macarius and Mearsheimer, and I'm paraphrasing, but correct me if I'm wrong, if my appraisal on this point is wrong, that when he goes to China, he explains to them that the issue isn't China or America per se, but the logic of international relations that causes one to see the other at fault in a logic-imposed control or fight for supremacy. Doesn't this point of view have to assume that the participants are being honest actors? However, China is, I would argue that America is not. And the logic, quote unquote, of this situation is not purely logic that is superimposed, but it's a logic that each participant is accepting. Meaning, it's not God imposed. It's something that the participants are choosing to view as the way to which they must operate. And I will go further into that and say that because the US views this stuff as zero sum, it almost forces the other participants in the game to behave in a similar fashion. My main question to this is it true that this is not necessarily God-given? It's something that is being chosen. I'm going to bring Glenn into this conversation. Let's bring him in. Come on.
The first question.
There we go. All right. I'm bringing in Glenn Diesen. Glenn Diesen is a Norwegian political scientist. He's professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. And I'm going to let him respond.
I think it's important to note that the international system is defined by anarchy, and that simply means there's no single one dominant state in the international system. So this makes security competition the natural state or the main source for conflict. So what John was referring to is that conflict is quite natural, as one should see that the United States has a natural interest to seek dominance, because if you dominate the entire international system, this is the best way to stay safe. Meanwhile, China, as a rising power, obviously has a security interest not to live under a U.S. Dominant region, so it will seek to challenge this. So the main point of Professor Mearsheimer is therefore not that necessarily the US is on the right side or China's on the right side or anyone is wrong. It's simply that this is the condition under anarchy, in which there is no one center of power, that conflict becomes the natural state. And of course, one cannot attempt to mitigate, but there's also limited how much one can do to enhance security. Now, of course, me and Mearsheimer, we tend to differ a little bit on this issue, because while I argued John Mearsheimer sees global primacy as being the main source of security, I think that the objectives has to be matched by resources, and obviously a country which no longer can aspire for global dominance simply because its resources don't stretch that far anymore, it's not a good strategy. It would be as if India or Germany would seek for global dominance. It simply doesn't reflect the international distribution of power, which means it's very destructive. So in political science, you would assume a country to expand its power until it's been balanced. Now, from my perspective, the US has been balanced, and the whole concept of having a hegemonic security is somewhat flawed, because it entails trying to expand power even if it diminishes your own security, and this is what makes it irrational. I think US security would be enhanced if you would be more willing to recognize the existing distribution of power. That's simply, if you're going to try to dominate the Russian borders, for example, in Ukraine, or dominate along the Chinese coastline, this is a way of maximizing power, but in no way will this help your security. If anything, it will bring a lot of destruction. So I guess this is the one area where we might, where me and John might differ, as I'm more critical, I guess, of hegemony to the extent it's no longer feasible or matched up with this means. Now, in terms, you also asked about the US government, and I would agree. I think they are very dishonest, because it's important, if you want to maximize your own security, to have a rational assessment of the competing interest in the international system. Obviously, there's no reason to expect why US and Chinese interests should be exactly the same. And their interests are a lot in conflict. But the United States has a tendency to frame the whole world as being a struggle of good versus evil. At the moment, this is expressed as liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. In the past, it was the civilized versus the barbarians. Either way, the world is of good versus evil, and this suggests that the US has altruistic goals, something that serves the benefit of mankind. And this is why the concept of hegemony is linked to liberalism. That is, when the United States speaks of liberal democracy, it treats it as a hegemonic norm. If the world believes in liberal democracy, they have to accept American leadership. Now, in contrast, there's little, if any, recognition of legitimate security concerns of adversaries. Keep in mind, even during the Cold War, you can look up in a newspaper and we would know what are the Soviets concerned about, or what are their security interests. Well, not anymore. I think none of us can remember the last time we opened a newspaper and could read what perhaps Russia or China or any adversaries of the United States, what are their legitimate security concerns? This should be the first thing to be addressed if you want to assess the international system, but we don't. And this is very problematic, because if you want to understand the policies of the adversary, you need to first understand what its security concerns are. And given that we skip that entire issue because there's a fear of legitimizing the opponent, we're not in a position to explain anymore their policy. Why does Russia do what it does? Why does China do what it does? Well, everything happens in a vacuum if we don't recognize that they have legitimate security concerns that are threatened. So if everything happens in a vacuum, we usually end up with really, well, lack of a better word, dumb explanations for the policy. So Russia policies is dictated by Putin being, KGB agent. He's afraid of his people. He wants to restore the Soviet Union. He fears democracy. This kind of silly explanations, which makes no sense. And we attribute similar assumptions to China, that they're simply looking to conquer the world, and a lot of projections, to be honest. Your second question.
All right, so for the second question, isn't the idea that the logic of supremacy is natural is contradicted by John himself when he agreed that China would have been a different non-interventionist unipolar power had that moment happened to China? And what I mean by that, they got into this conversation, part of the conversation boiled down to this idea that if China experienced the unipolar moment instead of the United States, would it have been fundamentally different in the way that it operated, considering that they had a culture that was somewhat non-interventionalist as compared to the Western culture? My point to him was, doesn't that contradict John Mearsheimer's point of view that these countries are fighting for supremacy in a natural, God-given struggle for supremacy on the world stage, when, from my point of view, these things are choices? And that China, because of the way it was culturally developed, that it would have behaved differently than this kind of interventionalist unipolar power, which kind of goes to my point that these things are choices, is not necessarily self or God given. That was basically the question. Isn't that idea of supremacy contradicted by this notion that China would have most likely not been an interventionalist power if it experienced the unipolar moment as opposed to America?
Question was the idea that the logic of supremacy is natural. You argue that this is contradicted by John. Agreed that China would be different now, and I agree with this, but it also has to be said that realism, or political realism, is not necessarily a foreign policy theory. It's more an assumption or a set of rules about how a state would have to act in order to, a rational state, to maximize its own security. Now, me personally, I tend to subscribe a lot to neoclassical realism because it puts the decision maker in as an intervening variable between this international distribution of power and foreign policy. Now, from this perspective, I see that it's more likely for decision makers to be influenced or embrace ideologies of dominance if there is such an international distribution of power. Now, I think that this obviously explains the U.S. policy. The U.S., for instance, the initial colonies, it expands to the west. It didn't really have any major adversaries. Once it reached the Pacific, it set off to dominate the Pacific Ocean, East Asia. After World War II, it was able to become one out of two major powers. And then after the Cold War, it had this unipolar moment. So from manifest destiny to liberal hegemony, it's always been an assumption that the American dominance is a force for good in the world, that it's a different country than anyone else, and it's a bit taller, sees a bit further along these lines, which is why the dominance becomes, it's more predisposed, if you will, to an ideology of dominance, because if it has a hegemonic position, it also has to create a system of beliefs to legitimize why it should dominate the world. And I think these ideologies tend to be also a reflection of power. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a contradiction, because for the realist, everything is a reflection of power. the international systems, the rules that dictates the international systems, and I would also see the ideologies which are embraced by states. Obviously, if you're a small or medium-sized state, you will favor international law, which heightens the role of sovereign equality and the UN Charter. If you're a dominant state or possible hegemons such as the United States, you will embrace ideas such as sovereign inequality, that one is a bit elevated above the others. You will begin to replace international law with, for example, this rules-based international order, where the US can make up the rules as they go along and expect others to follow. But of course, if you're a strict realist, one would assume to some level that all countries would act in the same way. But I guess this is where neorealists and neoclassical realists tend to differ. Yes, your third question.
All right. So, okay. So it sounds like he's agreeing with me that this stuff is not, because what it sounds like, Mearsheimer takes this point of view that all countries effectively act the same, that they act purely within their own self-interest. I guess my point of view is that ideology ends up being involved in many of the decisions that take place in the way that the countries engage and interact with one another. That, yeah, they are acting in self-interest, but that self-interest doesn't necessarily mean that it's immediately we are at war or we're fighting for supremacy. A country can very well make the choice, we don't want to do this. The world, in fact, can make the choice that we are going to engage each other in different ways. That doesn't necessarily have to immediately go to this notion of hostility, and that deconfliction can be a standard and a norm, in which case that will be considered the natural way of engaging and interacting with one another. I don't buy this premise that we're stuck in this kind of cage match for supremacy. Countries can decide to behave differently. The third question was also pursuant to the first question. Doesn't the point of view ignore that only one rival, one participant is necessary for this, quote, fight for supremacy logic to become the standard? Every Asian guest that I've had on the show, and I've had the opportunity to interview, make the point that China believes in win-win relationships, meaning they believe that we can engage in a way that doesn't necessarily end up with both of us at each other's throats. If they are right, how does a country that believes in win-win relationships deal with a country that believes in zero-sum relationships? I asked that to my Chinese guests, but I'm asking him the exact same question. How does a country like China that believes in win-win relationships deal with a country that believes in zero-sum outcomes? And not just zero-sum outcomes, how doesn't it force that win-win relationship country into zero-sum methods also? My point of view is that you only need one country in order to force the other countries to behave in a particular way. It's kind of like a cop. A cop is not necessarily trying to kill the person they're trying to capture, but they will do so if their life is threatened in that process, meaning they would change their point of view, and their point of view would evolve into the lowest common denominator, which is violence, if pushed to that point. I'm saying, isn't the same thing true with international relations and countries? Regardless of what China does, the very fact that the US is a zero-sum country forces China on some level to be the same. Let's hear his answer for this one.
You mentioned that your guests have the opportunity during interviews to say that China believes in win-win relationships, and I guess a win-win actor, such as China defines itself, could become pulled into zero-sum thinking if it's in conflict with a zero-sum actor. Now, but it also has to be said, one hasn't seen a clear evidence that China has done this yet, because keep in mind, when the United States pursues a hegemonic policy, how does a country how does it become able to dominate the entire international system? If you look at the US share, population, or it can be even military power, which is obviously dominates our economy. Yes, it's obviously very powerful, but the ability to dictate to the entire world is not really there. So you can't have a multipolar system of multilateralism where all our states argue or not argue, but attempt to harmonize interests if you want to dominate. It doesn't work. You don't have enough power. So a hegemonic system depends on an alliance system. Alliance system or peacetime alliances, which by the way are very disruptive to international stability and ability to mitigate security competition. An alliance system is designed to divide the world into enemies and vassals. Now, if you have an alliance system, you create divisions between your allies and your opponents. As long as there's some security or conflicts looming, so just as long as peace doesn't break out, there's some tensions, the allies will become very dependent on the security provider, which is the United States, which will make them then obedient both in the economic and the political sphere. Hence, they become vassals. And I think it's reasonable to refer to the Europeans these days as vassals of the Americans. Meanwhile, the adversaries, be it the Russia, India, Iran, China, they can be, as potential rivals, they can be weakened by using the vassals to contain them. So this is why in an alliance system, the US always has an interest to preserve conflicts, to have this perpetual conflict. So be it between the Europeans and Russians, between the Arabs in Iran, between India and China, this would be very good for the United States because it divides the world into weakened adversaries and dependent allies. And now, why I'm saying that China hasn't succumbed yet to this zero-sum thinking is simply because there's no evidence of it. China is renowned for rejecting military alliances. It doesn't want to join one. It sees this as being very disruptive. Also, it legitimizes and incentivizes counter-alliances. So this is not a good position. If China engages in a military alliance with Iran, it would alienate the Arab states. If it goes in a military alliance with Russia, it would alienate the Europeans. So it's not something that it wants. It wants to, again, win-win. It wants to get along with everyone. So it avoids the alliance systems. And it also rejects the whole hegemonic ideology that it represents all people. So, for example, when the US says, liberal democracy is a universal value, this means it can intervene anywhere in the world to represent or defend these rights, these universal rights and values. Now, China said something very different. It says it believes in a system of civilizational diversity. That is, one civilization cannot tell another one what to do because all states and civilizations have their own path to modernization. So I simply don't see that China has the ability or the intention to pursue global primacy, and it doesn't have the same crusader state mentality to it. Now, that being said, of course, it can change in the future. If China becomes all-powerful, it might pursue an ideology that legitimizes its dominance, but it simply doesn't seem that this is possible in the multipolar system. Even its best ally and friend, not ally, but a strategic partner, which would be China, would begin to gravitate towards other centers of power if the Chinese would become attempting to dictate to them how they should live and interfering in their domestic affairs. So, I recently asked that same question to President Putin actually in Valdai because I spoke with many people, different ambassadors and military people from the global south, and they're all very eager to join BRICS be part of BRICS because it was a way of being part of this community of win-win, of multipolarity and avoiding bloc politics. So many were concerned that institutions such as BRICS could become a bloc on its own that is pursuing zero-sum objectives of trying to being anti-American and anti-Western. This is why I asked Putin as well if it's possible, like if they are determined for BRICS to be an anti-hegemonic grouping or anti-Western, because if they become anti-Western, then they become a bloc itself, and this becomes zero-sum politics. So again, with Putin at least, I was quite optimistic about his answer, and from my perspective, it seems China is falling along the same lines. That is, it rejects the hegemonic system because this is about zero-sum, but it still wants to accommodate and trade with the United States and essentially get along and find a multipolar system where they can live side by side as sovereign equals. Your fourth question.
The next question I asked him is whether or not he thinks Trump is serious about ending the war and whether or not he even has the capability and power to do so as president of the United States. Let's hear his answer.
When you asked about Trump, he discussed ending the Ukraine war. Can he follow through with this under Moscow's requirement? I tend to be quite pessimistic on this. Of course, I'm more optimistic that he wants to get an end to this war, as opposed to Biden and NATO now, which seems determined to prolong the war as much as possible. But in early 2022, there wasn't a simple peace settlement. Simply that Ukraine would restore its neutrality and Russia would pull back its military. It was very straightforward. However, now we have a very different situation. That is, after almost 3 years of fighting, there have been huge border changes, and both Russia and Ukraine have good reasons to feel a lot of insecurity. So the main demand for Russia has to be neutrality for Ukraine. They can't live with anything else. They're not going to have NATO troops patrolling any frozen front lines. This is unacceptable. So not just no NATO, they don't want any de facto NATO membership, what we saw after 2014 when NATO began to build up its capabilities in Ukraine, building up an army there, essentially directing its security services. So no, full neutrality is the main demand still of Russia, but they also want the Ukrainians to accept and the West to accept territorial changes, as Russia's taken these 4 more oblasts. So he wants this plus Crimea. Now, obviously, this is very hard, if not even impossible, for Ukraine to accept. Given that the suffering they've had in this war, that they now would not just have no security guarantees, but they would also have to surrender territory. But again, it might not be up to Ukraine, because the deal. It might be this deal or a worse deal, because if the war goes on, it might lose even more territory. And the real question is Trump, because if he thinks it's best for America, he will push through irrespective of what Ukraine says. So from my perspective, I think Trump can probably play ball with the neutrality issue to pull out of Ukraine, away from Ukraine. But I think the Russians will realize this can change immediately once he's out of office. So you get 4-hour ceasefire, 4-year ceasefire. But the Americans don't stick to their agreement. So once a new president comes in, they will reinterpret it. So no agreement will be very durable, I think. So for this reason, they also need the territorial changes. So in the future, these territories can't be used as a front line anymore against Russia. So, but I think it will be very difficult for Trump to accept these huge territorial changes, especially the territories which Russia demands, which it isn't controlling yet. I think this is very problematic. But again, who knows? Maybe Russia is willing to discuss the administrative borders of the 4 oblasts it has annexed. But my main concern is that Trump, he wants to get an end to the war, but he sees himself as a great negotiator. When he doesn't get the deal he wants, what's going to happen? Well, who knows? I think he will put max pressure on both sides. He can probably break the Ukrainians, but for Russia, this is an existential threat. So there's simply very little room for him to maneuver. So if he doesn't get the deal he wants, he might step up pressure against Russia, and it will be a continuation of the Biden policies. So I'm a bit pessimistic, but I guess more reason for hope than with the current government in the United States.
All right, I'm going to end it on that. I have one more question posed to Glenn, but I can bring that back in a separate video. Glenn Diesen, he is Norwegian political scientist, professor at the University of Southeastern Norway.